Hello, and welcome to the very fourth episode of Just Jank. I'm your host, Brian. What middle name? I don't have a middle name. Oren. That'll do it for the untap step. Let's go to the upkeep. This episode is filmed in front of a live studio audience at a Wendell's Real Food and Drive-In. Wendell's, come for the live entertainment. Stay because the doors lock from the outside. Here in the upkeep, as always, let's remember what jank is. Let's recall cards are not jank. Decks, on the other hand, very much are. You could have a deck with all 7 currently in print Phyrexian Praetors, and it could still play like a newt, fresh out of the vat, staring bewildered at the vat priests who produced it. Remember, if you're trying to tell a story with your deck, if you've put together Oops, All Elk, if your whole goal is to keep every player alive as long as possible, you might have a jank deck. Jank is finding a way to express something about yourself, or this game that we all love to play. Recall also that jank does not mean sacrificing power. In today's deck, we'll see several very oppressive effects, sporadically encountered and poorly utilized. But that's okay. Let's find out what I mean in the draw step. Today's episode is my very fourth saved deck on Scryfall.com featuring Judith, the Scourge Diva. This is a revamp of last week's Alesha Who Smiles at Death deck, but now we lack white. We still have a recursion deck, and we're looking to deal either lots of direct damage or just enough damage of a certain type a little bit at a time. If that sounds like a clue to you, you've got a good ear. It's a secret infect deck. Let's take a look at Judith. For 1 black and a red, she is a 2/2 human shaman that says, other creatures you control get +1/+0. So we start with a nice little lord effect. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Judith the Scourge Diva deals 1 damage to any target. We can see how infect will probably serve us very well in this game. So what we're looking at doing is killing enough of our non-token creatures, hence the recursion, over time, or more ideally all at once, to just kill our opponents. We can accomplish that by giving Judith her self-infect, but we also have some other ways of reaching that infect-based win. First, let's find out how we set up our game in the Precombat main phase. Here in the Precombat main phase, as usual, I like to talk about the ramp package first. This deck has 3 mana rocks, as usual, Soul Ring, Commander Sphere, and Mind Stone. I guess at this point I was still figuring out how mana production really works. Judith cares about non-token creatures dying, so Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar are going to make a return. They're very important artifacts in any deck which remotely resembles an aristocrat's build. Expedition Map is also back, a critical piece for those utility lands later in the game, but so are Traveler's Amulet and Wayfarer's Bauble, which help us get our basics out onto the board. This is a Recursion Matters deck, so Burnished Heart and Pilgrim's Eye are also returning. Burnished Heart, which kills itself, a necessary feature for Judith, and Pilgrim's Eye, which we can recur onto the battlefield for another basic. I'm going to include Demonic Tutor and Diabolic Tutor one more time, because our ramp situation is quite bad. However, we do also have Black Market, and if we can get it out early enough and kill enough creatures, also early enough, our pre-combat main phase should have plenty of black mana to do whatever we need to do with. Let's move on to the land situation. We're only in 2 colors, so we've only got 1 shock, but we do have a couple fetch lands, and our basic fetches, Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, the commander staples themselves. For utility lands, we're in black, so we've got Bojuka Bog. Absolutely critical, especially if our opponents are even going to be looking at their graveyards. Rogue's Passage is in the deck again, even though this isn't really a combat deck, but we might get to that point where we just need that little bit of extra damage and we don't have any other way to do it. Phyrexian Tower is a notable include in this deck because it sacrifices one of our creatures, and it does give us 2 mana instead of just 1. Volrath's Stronghold is back. It's a recursion deck. It's a necessary include. For our secret tech of infecting our opponents out, we've got Karn's Bastion, which has a proliferate ability. So all we really need to do is figure out how to give our opponents one infect, and then just play the long game. Speaking of playing the long game, I mentioned that this isn't really a combat deck, but we do have a couple pieces that probably want to swing as often as possible, so let's check those pieces out in the combat step. Here in the combat step, we talk about trying to achieve that classic win condition of simply bludgeoning our opponents to death. And although this isn't a combat deck, we do have creatures that we want to turn sideways as often as possible. Starting with Dreadhorde Butcher. When it deals combat damage to a player, it grows bigger, and since it costs so little and has haste, maybe we can get this out before blocks come down. Plus, when it does die, it zaps something for its power, which might be those last few life points on an opponent, or just a utility piece on its board. We also have Corrosive Mentor, which gives all of our black creatures Wither, which is very useful on offense because we whittle down the blocking line, and on defense because we whittle down their attacking line. Very useful effect. I also mentioned that this is an infect deck, so all of the creatures that natively have the infect keyword should be turning sideways as often as possible to try and get all of those poison counters on our opponents. Ichor Mirror starts us off, which is really useful because when it becomes blocked, it gets +2/+2 and whittles down that blocking line even more. Necropede is really useful, not only because it has infect, but when it is blocked and dies, it passes out a -1/-1 counter, so it kind of has Wither. Corpse Cur is very useful, not only as an infect creature, but when it dies, it recurs another infect creature. And some of these creatures are very useful, such as Hand of the Praetors. It has infect, it has an infect lord effect, making our infect creatures +1/+1, and when we cast infect spells, that maybe we've recurred with Corpse Cur, it passes out a poison counter. Absolutely phenomenal include. Reaper of Sheoldred rounds out the list. When it takes damage, we pass out a poison counter. This is not only great when attacking, if we're sure they're going to block, but also as a blocker. Absolutely phenomenal. And although there are quite a few creatures that we don't necessarily want to be attacking as often as possible, Grafted Exoskeleton is in the deck to give them infect and maybe make them an additional infect creature for our win con. That's about it for combat, though. I said it's not a combat deck, so let's go to the post-combat main phase and find out all of the ways that we can try to infect our opponents out of nowhere. Welcome to the post-combat main phase, where we talk about building our board, gaining some momentum, and trying to find that win con. Let's start by talking about card advantage with Sidisi Undead Vizier. As we saw last time, when she enters the battlefield, she can exploit a creature and tutor any card. Similarly, Runescarred Demon enters the battlefield and just tutors any card. That brings our tutors to 4, which sounds really powerful, but we probably need all 4 at once to assemble a win con out of nowhere. We also have Demon of Dark Schemes, and when creatures die, we get energy counters, which we can proliferate, as we'll see later, and we can spend that energy to get creatures back out onto the battlefield, which is a really powerful effect and absolutely critical because we really don't have any card draw in the deck. Sepulchral Primordial makes an appearance, which is really fun because it steals creatures out of our opponent's graveyards, so we can disrupt their plans and maybe start using those plans against them. Sanitarium Skeleton is a nice recursion piece because it comes right back to our hand for redeployment, and Reassembling Skeleton comes to the battlefield tapped. Not very good as a blocker, but does have its uses. Relentless Dead is an amazing card because not only does it recur itself to our hand, but it recurs our zombies to the battlefield, which are Dreadhorde Butcher, Hand of the Praetors, and Sidisi Undead Vizier. We've talked a lot about graveyards and death effects. Let's talk about our death and sacrifice synergies. Stalking Vengeance is in the deck, which is really fun because when creatures die, they shoot something for their power, which meshes really well with Judith's ability. Sheoldred Whispering One brings creatures from our graveyard to the battlefield, something we definitely want to do, and our opponents have to sacrifice creatures on their upkeeps, so it keeps their boards a little bit low, raises ours up a little bit, and I feel it's a lot more balanced than something like Dictate of Erebos. Flayer of the Hatebound is a really nice include with all of our recursion pieces, because when creatures enter the battlefield from our graveyard, they shoot something for their power. Warstorm Surge is an effect just like the Flayer, that when creatures enter the battlefield, they shoot something for their power. And Electropotence, once again, is the miniature Warstorm Surge, where we can pay mana per creature. Finally, we have Bolas's Citadel, and in a pinch, if we're really desperate and we don't have a lot of time left, we can start spending our life to cast cards off the top of our library. And maybe, if everybody is at a low enough life total, we can just use its sacrifice ability to kill everybody. It's a rare occurrence, but it could happen. So, I talked about our life total getting low. We probably need some protection. Carnifex Demon is really useful in this regard because it can send its 2 -1/-1 counters onto the rest of the board, shrinking all of our opponents' creatures at once, as well as the rest of ours, but that's okay. We want our creatures to die anyway. Massacre Girl is an incredibly effective board wipe, lots of fun to use in basically any deck that has black in it, although she does lower the power, so certain cards like Warstorm Surge and Stalking Vengeance might not be as effective. Spikeshot Elder is a really fun include because it pings creatures according to its power, and it doesn't tap. Similarly, Spikeshot Goblin does tap to ping creatures, but it costs less to activate. So, bit of a trade-off. 2 extra abilities to send direct damage at places, really useful. Speaking of direct damage, Murderous Redcap, when it enters the battlefield, shoots something for its power. We saw how effective this could be in the previous episode. And once again, it has a persist ability, which is really nice. Urabrask the Hidden brings in our creatures with haste, which is really useful, especially for our pingers that tap. And our opponent's creatures enter tapped, so they have fewer blockers, maybe. Speaking of pings, Burning Anger is an enchantment that just lets one of our creatures shoot something. Really useful, especially for some of our larger creatures. And then Grim Affliction puts a -1/-1 counter on a creature and has a proliferate ability. So it's actually -2/-2, and if our other creatures have already been affected by Carnifex Demon or Wither or Infect, we make all of those go up as well, including our opponent's poison counters, which is very important. We also have Black Sun Zenith, which distributes -1/-1 counters everywhere, and functions in a similar vein to Massacre Girl. Widespread Brutality is sort of a miniature board wipe. It's probably just going to be 2, unless we recur it somehow, but 2 damage across the board can situationally be very important. Plus we get a zombie army out of it. And finally, Spread the Sickness is our one piece of targeted spell-based removal, and could be a board wipe, maybe, with a proliferate. So, I've mentioned Infect and Wither a lot at this point. Let's talk about our Infect combos to try and win the game. Phyresis is an enchantment that just straight up gives Infect. If we can put this on a large creature like Runescarred Demon and keep it swinging, or keep it pinging, maybe we win the game really quickly after that. Tainted Strike is a similar effect on an instant that just gives a creature Infect out of nowhere. So if we have a big surprise, which we'll see in a moment, we could destroy the whole table. Let's talk about Arc Bond. This is really useful with infected creatures. When they get blocked or block something themselves, they just blow up and send the damage everywhere. And if they're infected, that's poison counters on our opponents. Soulsfire, same thing. We just shoot for the power. And if it's an infected Runescarred Demon, that's 6. That's a lot. Volt Charge is a lightning bolt plus a proliferate effect. So if we've been infecting and we can get proliferate, we're really running the game down as fast as possible. In a similar vein, we've got Gravitic Punch. So once again, a creature just shoots something for its power. And Chandra's Ignition, probably the most likely card to actually win us the game. It just explodes and deals damage to everything on the board and all of our opponents except us. We're probably not going to kill ourselves with infect, but just in case, let's avoid that if possible. We've also got Contagion Clasp, a useful artifact that puts a -1/-1 counter on something and taps to proliferate. Contagion Engine, which does the same thing except it proliferates twice. And finally, Throne of Geth. We don't have a lot of artifacts that we can sacrifice, but it is a proliferate effect. And if our opponents are at 9 poison counters, there's no reason not to do this. So that's a lot of cards to try and put together and infect our opponents out of the game. It's probably pretty obvious why this deck is so janky, but let's go to the end step and really discuss why. Welcome to the end step, where we talk about why our deck is so incredibly janky, and that's probably pretty obvious this week, but just in case, let's run it down. We don't have card draw. That's an incredibly debilitating whiff on our deck's part. We are going to be so much slower than our opponents, it's not even funny. We do have 4 tutor effects, but infect is possibly the most dangerous win con to attempt. Statistical fact, the table will kill you within 5 turns of finding out that infect is your win con. So you have to do it fast, which we can't. However, most of our infect damage will come from bits and pieces. Maybe we put Grafted Exoskeleton on Judith. Maybe we just draw Tainted Strike and Judith gets to ping something once. Maybe we get Corpse Cur in once or twice. All of our infect damage is going to fall well below that crucial 10 poison counter mark, unless we get all of our pieces put together at once, which is probably going to be Runescarred Demon and Grafted Exoskeleton. So even though we have creature-based removal, we've only got 1 spell and then a lot of direct damage. If our opponents play any kind of stacks effects, we don't have a way of dealing with it. We're completely at their mercy if we have to get around Ghostly Prison or Norn Xanax or anything like that. Since our recursion engines, while powerful, are still very slow, and our board probably won't be that big at any point in the game, even if we get to swing with Krenko a few times, we can expect to have our hands full in the combat step, trying to stave off all our opponents' attacks. It's going to be rough going, even if we have infect at the forefront, blocking everything and making it smaller. So all that said, let's go to the cleanup step. Welcome to the cleanup step, and thanks again so much for watching. Thanks to our sponsors, whoever they are, whenever they choose to exist, and thanks again to Ben Cope of Once Lizard, Sometimes Snake for our theme song. If you missed it last time, please go check out his latest album, Parable of the Dreamer, on his site, olss.space. Link in the description. Finally, to the Finks at Wizards of the Coast. You know as well as I do that the community comes first, and what the community demands now, more than ever, is jumbo-sized foil. Copies of Commander Staple Simoon. Print it. That'll do it for this episode. Thanks once again for watching, and remember, you don't need a great deck to have a great time. See ya.